Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Salatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. My name is Ismail Royer. I am director of the Islam and Religious Freedom Action Team at the Religious Freedom Institute. We're a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. that advocates for religious freedom for everyone, everywhere. And I am, as I mentioned, the director of the Islam team there, which examines and advocates for religious freedom from within the traditions of Islam. I'm here today with a very distinguished guest as part of our series on Islam and the state. We have had several videos, several webinars so far over the past maybe year and a half or so, with very interesting guests to discuss the question of Islam and the modern nation state. And so this is a very, very exciting opportunity to discuss this this issue with the author of a new book on the subject. And my guest today is Dr. Osama Al-Azmi. Dr. Al-Azmi can correct me whether tell me whether or not his Arabic pronunciation is actually Azmi or is it actually a Zay in there. But anyway,
right. My parents are Bangladeshi, so we say Azami.
Yes.
And sometimes Azmi, but it's Alva in Arabic.
So okay, so Dr. Al-Azmi. Now, so he is the departmental lecturer in contemporary Islamic studies at the University of Oxford, and he completed his BA in Arabic and Islamic studies at Oxford, and he completed his seminary training at Sanam Institute, and his MA and PhD in Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University, and he has studied Islamic sciences from many scholars, too many to mention, but I'll suggest that anyone who is interested in the extent of his Islamic, his traditional Islamic training can look at his biography on the website of our event page here, and we'll put a link to that in the event description. So, Dr. Al-Azmi, if I could just begin with asking you to discuss the import of your book, the reasons that you wrote it, and I suppose your conclusions, and go ahead and speak for as long as you feel you need to give us and the viewers a good rundown of your book.
Sure, thank you very much. And I'll just, for the interest of viewers, hold it up for a second. So Islam and the Arab Revolutions, the Ulama between democracy and autocracy. For North American audience members, and this is my first, actually this is my second discussion of the book with a North American audience, but we're all global now, so hopefully we'll have people from all over the place. Those interested in perhaps acquiring a copy of the book, the hardback is unfortunately, in keeping with academic presses, it's quite expensive. So there is a discount code which has been advertised kindly by Ismail on the website, RFI website.
We'll try to put a link to that in the description on the YouTube video.
Perfect. And if anyone's interested, there's also a discount code for the rest of the world, which you can get on my pinned tweet on Twitter. So this is a book which, as I say in the preface, it kind of was motivated to write it while I was pursuing my doctorate, and it's completely unrelated to my doctorate. So it ended up being a bit of a distraction from my doctorate, and considerably longer than it. And I really I started embarking on my doctoral studies as a PhD candidate in, I want to say 2012, and that's in the midst of the Arab revolutionary upheavals, as you all know. I always wanted to study Islamic thought, and Islamic political thought was one dimension of that. But I was kind of adamant that for my doctorate I wouldn't work on something which is just contemporary sort of political shenanigans and activities and the like. I was interested in, I was kind of a pure sort of theorist in that sort of sense. And then this kind of overtook my life. I was particularly, I think, after the 2013 coup in Egypt, which I write about, July 2013, and I happened to be in an academic conference in Virginia in the presence of august scholars like Nathan Brown and others in a small sort of like room. Abdullah Al-Aryan was in the room, and I think Nathan and Abdullah were basically chairing a panel discussing sort of the politics of Islamism in a sense, and you know, from that point onwards and what transpired that summer with the massacre of large numbers of people in Egypt, and the subsequent sort of revelations that there were some ulama, in the main one alim, for those who are unfamiliar with this term, that's a word which means religious scholar, um, in the Islamic tradition. So there was one alim who basically legitimated the actions of the military in perpetrating the coup and then perpetrating mass murder of probably over 1,000 people who were at that time sort of opposing the coup and calling for a restoration of democracy. And that really spurred me on to think, okay, well, there's something very wrong here. Partly, I think I was driven by the fact that I myself, something I talk about in the introduction, I'm an alim, and I'm trained in the same traditions that many of these scholars will be trained in. And I could not, abide the thought that this is something which could be countenanced by my religious tradition. So how could it be that people who are ostensibly the sort of upholders of that moral tradition, that religious and moral tradition, were behaving in this unconscionable way? And I mean, some of it hits home because some of the scholars I write about are either teachers of mine directly or teachers of my teachers. And so as a consequence of that, I basically started sort of writing bits and pieces here and there. I wrote a couple of journalistic pieces as well. But over time, I realized I really needed to write at great length, and that's what I did over the last few years. And just to give a broad overview, that's kind of the motivation of the book. The book has an introduction, 9 chapters, and a conclusion and an epilogue, and then 3 appendices of varying length. So very briefly, the introduction kind of sets the scene, explains who's who. The book primarily focuses on Egypt, even though the first chapter looks at Tunisia briefly, because that's where this all kind of starts up. The first chapter looks at Yusuf al-Qaradawi. So Yusuf al-Qaradawi is this Egyptian scholar based in Qatar. He's still alive. He's in his late 90s at this point, retired from public life. And he comes out quite forcefully advocating for what he describes as peaceful revolution or peaceful protest. And as a means of trying to engage in what he calls Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar, commanding right and forbidding wrong. This is a Quranic and deeply sort of felt Islamic value on which Michael Cook has written a 700-page book with Cambridge University Press. And so from that, the next chapter, chapter 2, looks at the spillover of the revolution to Egypt. And Egypt is the most populous country in the Middle East, and was at the time and continues to be. And so, in a sense, if Egypt were affected by this, then the entire region is affected by it. And so, lots of people are saying, oh, this would never happen in Egypt. But it actually transpires that the Egyptian revolution is eventually successful after 18 days. And Qaradawi is actually very supportive of this, sitting in Qatar, being beamed into the region by Al Jazeera. The Qataris had actually more or less adopted as a foreign policy stance that they would use Al Jazeera as a means of projecting or in some respects fomenting revolution in most of the region. They kind of did the opposite with the Bahraini revolutions. And I talk about that briefly in chapter 2 as well. So this is kind of, Qaradawi plays the role early on as the pro-revolutionary scholar, and I'm less interested in giving a representative overview of how many scholars there are doing that. I'm more interested in looking at the sorts of arguments that are presented by the most articulate representatives of that class who are pro-revolutionary. And then the next 2 chapters look at anti-revolutionary scholars, and here I look at a slightly larger sort of set of scholars, still a small number, a total of 5 scholars. One of them is the Sheikh al-Azhar, or the sort of most highest ranking sort of scholar in the Egyptian state hierarchy. He's the rector of the Azhar, and he actually also has the rank of a minister as of 1961. And in addition to him, there is the Grand Mufti of Egypt, Ali Gum'a, the person I mentioned as kind of supporting the mass murder a couple of years later. So, I mean, I'm talking about 2011 at the moment.
Right.
I didn't make that quite so clear. And so we're, the Egyptian revolution succeeds in February of 2011. But in the lead up to that, in the 18 days that led up to that, Ahmed al-Tayyib, the Sheikh al-Azhar, Ali Gum'a, the Grand Mufti, a student of Ali Gum'a's who's kind of a popular preacher, Ali al-Jifri, and then, those three most notably really speak out against this kind of revolutionary action to differing degrees of intensity, but it's quite clear that they all oppose it. And then, that chapter gives way to a fourth chapter, which is kind of looks at a couple of scholars whose positions are ambiguous. Abdullah bin Bayya, one of the sort of most respected jurists of the Middle East at the time, was largely silent. He was someone who was a vice president to Yusuf al-Qaradawi at Yusuf al-Qaradawi's institution in Qatar. And his student, Hamza Yusuf, a well-known sort of a religious figure in North America, and a convert to Islam, back in the 1970s, but a prominent Muslim public figure, basically comes out strongly in favor of the Egyptian revolution after kind of having been a little uncertain about the Tunisian revolution, which I remark is quite out of character for him in a sense. And then I kind of jump from looking at those scholars and their various arguments in a sense. Hamza Yusuf kind of transitions back into a position where he's opposed to revolution. And I look at the reasoning of the various scholars. So Yusuf Qaradawi for the first couple of chapters, and the other scholars for the next two chapters. And then I shift to 2013, or I sort of transition to 2013 and look at the justifications that, the tables have now turned. The revolutionaries are now being ousted by a military coup in Egypt. And the people who are saying rebelling against Mubarak was, haram. That's the Islamic phrase for it. It's Islamically prohibited. Were now saying that actually protests are legitimate, and the people who are saying that revolution against Mubarak was legitimate started saying that actually protesting against the democratically elected President Morsi is illegitimate. Not necessarily illegitimate, but they were saying that deposing him by force is illegitimate. And so, the tables have now turned and the reasoning has now kind of reversed. And so I examine the ways in which that happens. And that sort of transpires into the Rabaa massacre, which is kind of like the culminating moment in the book. I kind of give a narrative of how that takes place. And then the reactions of these various scholars, including some other Azhari scholars. In chapter 8, I look at sort of Azharis who I don't mention in earlier chapters, who opposed the coup. And then in the final chapter, I kind of look at some of the secondary literature. This is a bit more of an academic chapter, but it might be of interest, Ismail, for our discussion, where I consider, okay, well, what does the classical Islamic tradition say about these sorts of things?
Right.
And that brings me to a conclusion. I hope that is a nice sort of useful overview of the text.
Yeah, it is. And this book is so significant to our particular interest of this webinar series that we're doing, and also significant to me because it's something that I've been thinking a lot about, and it's significant to many people because many Muslims have been preoccupied with the question of how do we understand the rules and the guidance of Islamic governance in the modern world, and it's a qualitatively different question to ask. What do the Quran, the Sunnah, and the canon of scholarship of our ulama of the past, what guidance do they offer for us in 2022, that's a very different question than what guidance does it offer in, say like 1600 or 1400. People who then might have been trying to understand what does Islamic governance look like. In pre-modern times, it's a very different question from modern times, and the reason for that is the very, very significant differences in understanding that modernity has wrought, and not only understandings but also actual like realities on the ground. So, for example, the belief that borders are inviolable somehow is an ideological belief, but it is.
Can I interject briefly?
Yes.
Sorry, forgive me. I mean, I think this is. I'd like to let you finish as well, but I was just going to say that actually, I think in all times through Islamic history, I mean, scholars have recognized the contingency of the way in which they've framed their understanding of what is required and what is not.
Right.
So I do think it's accentuated in the modern period, but I don't think it's qualitatively significantly different to how it was in the pre-modern era as well.
Yes. Well, the reason I put it that way is because there's and this is somewhat difficult to articulate, not just for me, but I mean there have been books written on this, untold books written on the subject, countless. But just for an example, right? An example being the development of the nation state, which takes the nation as the unit of social organization. And the nation, of course, means different things in different contexts. In some areas of the world, it's ethnic. In other places, like in the United States, it's a mixture of, to some degree ethnicity and also to some degree ideas, So the question is, I mean, so when we have, for example, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya writing a book, as I mentioned to you earlier, before we started here, writing a book on the nation state in Islam, and then really writing about the nation state without fully dealing with the actual difference between. I mean, there's no such thing as Algeria as a as a state before. You know what I mean? There was a Sham as a region, for example. There was a Khorasan, and there were these different, but there's no notion of this as a some sort of like unit.
Once again, I mean, like, and I don't think I disagree with you
Right.
in broad strokes, and I also want to apologize to viewers. My wife is dealing with 2 toddlers at the moment, so
No problem.
if some of them cry, please do excuse them. I without wanting to be sort of unduly rude, so to speak.
Yeah, of course. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, I don't think Abdullah bin Bay, I think Abdullah bin Bayya's understanding of these things is remarkably naive. But that doesn't surprise me. I don't think they're naive because he's not an intelligent man. I think they're in a sense calculated to be naive because they're there to sort of legitimate a certain order that is currently existent. So I mean, I'm not sure. I need to explore, because as far as I recall, it's just an essay, but I need to explore that particular text and see exactly what he's saying, because obviously it has massive ramifications. He's the Grand Mufti of the United Arab Emirates, which is the strategically, geopolitically most ambitious state in the region, and so it does have consequences. But
no, absolutely,
I agree with you entirely that
I mean, absolutely. Although first of all, I would not use the term naive for Sheikh Abdullah. All I would say is that I understand you do, but what I mean to say is that I think that we have a paradigm that we're looking at the world that in today, and that it's the nature of paradigms, that it's very difficult to escape from paradigms, and so what I mean to say, another interesting example of the nation state that differs, and this is going to be relevant to your book, I promise, that that makes things different, is that is the place of the divine in the order of the polity. So whereas in the past it was there's a divine hierarchy that that is reflected in the in the order of the polity, and there is also a this notion that the polity reflects reflects the creator in a very direct way, and the will of the creator and so on, the Lord of the universe. Whereas in our contemporary times, it's the state that is the really the default. The state is the most important primary existent. And so this is why we have, for example, you see like the official religion of the state will be the X. So in that sense, it's the state that is determining what is the official religion. You know what I mean? As opposed to the Islam or Christianity, whatever, being the reality. It's not an official religion. It is reality. So the reason I mention all that is to indicate that there and there are also very important differences in terms of notions of the sources of legitimacy, or the sources of authority, or the sources of sovereignty, however one might want to characterize that, and the different nuances between those different questions. And so many of these have their origins in Europe, and particularly in either the French Revolution on the one hand, or in the American Revolution, and which really is just a culmination of developments from England. So again, I want to mention that so there are ideological developments that are related to, that are often interact with technological developments and developments in political order. Okay, so what your book does is that it's a very important document in documenting how Muslims have sought to derive from their tradition how they are to understand notions of legitimacy, notions of justice, notions of sovereignty, and so on and so on. So that is why this is such an important book. And what you've done as well is that you've documented, and I think you've brought together and documented in one place many disparate statements. You've translated a lot of important things. For example, the statement of Ali Jum'a to the army after the Raba'a massacre. And so these are very important. So what I wanted to ask you was, and I could I could enter into this at many different places, but could you just sort of give us some more detail on what you found, on your conclusions in terms of the differences between the arguments of Yusuf al-Qaradawi? And by the way, I think it's useful for you to really focus on Yusuf al-Qaradawi because of his the fact of his the fact that he's so influential, that really all other discussions by people in his camp are really going to be following his lead, more or less. I mean, in the same way they say, like Western, that all of philosophy is a commentary on is footnotes on Plato. In reality, I mean, most Islamist thought, at least mainstream Islamist thought, is going to be commentary, or at least in light of what Qaradawi's thought has been. So if you could give us like sort of an outline of Qaradawi's arguments for supporting the Arab revolutions, and then some of the counter arguments from who you think are the most representative speakers for opposing those revolutions. And I understand that there's a difference between like 2011 and 2013 or something like that, but I hope we have time to get into that. So go ahead, and I'll give
Absolutely.
you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. No, this is so. I mean, you've said quite a few things, which are, I think, I'd like to also just maybe add my thoughts on as I try to respond to the particular question about Qaradawi's arguments. I mean, the way in which the nation state basically, in some respects, comes and takes the place of God in the modern social imaginary, and the nation is, in Benedict Anderson's sort of like memorable phrase, an imagined community.
Right.
But it's also an imagined community in a particular sense that is designed, Abdul Hakim Murad Tim Winter notes this in his recent book. It's a comment that he has running in his work for the last couple of decades, that in many respects the West's self-identity, and he talks very often in terms of Europe, but the West's self-identity is often fashioned in a negative kind of manner vis-a-vis Muslims. And so when it comes to its own seeing how it operates, it very often does so self-consciously, historically at least, I think, by contrasting itself with the Muslim other. And I think that that's something which needs to be borne in mind in our analysis and in the way in which we think about various categories, whether it's legitimacy, justice, and sovereignty, and all the rest of it. But one thing which I think is particularly noteworthy is that sort of substitution of God for the nation state, which is kind of like supposedly the manifestation of the imagined community. I mean, the point I was making about imagined communities is that the part of the Western understanding of nationalism is that you cannot have that wedded closely to a religion, so to speak. I mean, so in a sense, an Islamic conception of an imagined community, of an ummah, is problematic according to nationalism as a framework. And I think that that's that's a kind of I don't know how to put this, but it's basically the odds, or the odds are stacked against you if you want to be recognized in the modern world. Now, and that deification of the state is one of the important distinctions between someone like Qaradawi and someone like Ali Gumra. And this is a point I make in the conclusion. I kind of refer to it as a kind of quasi-divinization of the state. I'm just going to actually look up the phrase that I use, because this is in the conclusion of my book. And I mean, it's basically pages 249 to 250, where I look at, Bin Bayya and Gumra, in a sense, telling these sort of state lawmakers that they have absolute authority over any Sharia claims. So, and this is, Gumra does this in his practice. So when he basically tells them, look, you are entirely justified in perpetrating whatever massacres you need to in order to sort of preserve your self-identity.
I think you mentioned it on page 117, 118, 119.
So that's
yeah.
Many thanks. So this is something which also plays out. Yeah. So the principled legitimation of authoritarianism, that section, and I speak a bit about it in the conclusion of that chapter as well. So that's the chapter dedicated to Bin Bayya, barakallahu fikum. And I kind of provide a summary in the concluding section, in the conclusion as well, that this is my reading. I'd like to see sort of like alternative readings of Bin Bayya as well. Right. And I hope to follow this up later on. But this is where Bin Bayya has fully embraced modernity in this sense, or Gumra has, by saying that, look, sovereignty belongs to the state, which is a very kind of Hobbesian / Jean Baudin's conception of what sovereignty is. This was a reaction to the European wars of religion, where they were just worried about the scale of chaos, and it's very similar kind of arguments that are being made. Qaradawi's arguments, on the other hand, are basically to say they're very prudential when it comes to the question of revolution. So, for him, it's like, well, this isn't something which, there's a distinction between revolution and rebellion as well. So rebellion is, as is the case in the English language, it's armed by default. Revolution, Qaradawi specifically advocates peaceful revolution. He's very insistent on that phrase. And, I think in the pre-modern Islamic sort of conceptual frameworks, it's a bit of, it doesn't fit in terribly well in the way in which, the juristic tradition sort of thinks about these sorts of questions, because they say that, well, rebellion, in order for it to be considered, khuruj, it has to be armed. But in a sense, even though peaceful rebellion is not supposed to be armed, you are still forcing the incumbent out. And so, that's the end goal of a rebellion.
Yeah.
And so there is a resemblance there, even if Qaradawi is very insistent that we don't want the armed component to be there. So there is a bit of an aporia there, and I kind of, signal it in the conclusion, I think, and in other parts of the book. So, Qaradawi's argument is, this is the classic sort of like duality that we have here. Amr bil ma'ruf and nahi anil munkar. This is Qaradawi's side of things. And for the other side, it's like, we need to preserve order. We need to have safety. We need, we have to prevent fawda, so prevent anarchy. And these are judgment calls ultimately, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's up to people who are, informed and able to assess the situation to make that judgment call. And I don't hide the fact that I am very sympathetic to the democratically oriented folks, and very much against the pro-autocracy folks. At the same time, and this is one other point that I'd like to highlight, I mean, you point out legitimacy, justice, sovereignty. Also, another important concept, of course, is democracy. Another important concept is autocracy. All of these are part and parcel of the political language of Western political thought.
Yeah.
And one of the points that this isn't really a normative book. This is more of a descriptive history. And, that has its drawbacks, because I can't articulate sort of my conception of these categories in as much detail as I would like. And I hope to do that in future work, most certainly. But in my view, and this is something which I think was a bit of an anxiety of yours when you were reading the book, and this is an opportunity for me to clarify.
Mm-hmm.
All of these concepts will have their conceptions that are indigenously Islamic. So the Islamic tradition has content for these sorts of ideas, but they look different very often to what that content looks like in the Western tradition. So democracy means sovereignty belongs to the people in the West, but that's not what it means for someone like Qaradawi. And this is something which, I've sent this off for publication many months ago now. I don't know what's happened to it, but David Warren has a recent fantastic book. I don't know if you've had a chance to have a look at it, on Qaradawi and bin Bayya's sort of engagements with the Arab revolutions. It's a much shorter work. It was published at the beginning of last year. I unfortunately can't remember the name. I mean, this is really terrible of me. I've reviewed the book and I've interviewed David on it, but it has a kind of catchy name and a very long subtitle. And Rivals in the Gulf. So, David in his book points out, drawing on someone like Khalid Abul Fadl, that, well, Qaradawi doesn't actually have a very, thought out conception of democracy. And why does Khalid Abul Fadl say this? Well, he says, Qaradawi's conception of democracy is basically majoritarianism, and he doesn't acknowledge that actually the popular will can overturn things which may be divinely mandated, and that's something that he has to come to terms with democracy. My point is to say, well, actually, that's presupposing liberal democracy is the only template for democracy, right? Liberalism is, in the case of liberal democracy, liberalism marks out what the limits are for democracy, right? You can't sort of engage in pogroms and holocausts. You can't persecute minorities in the name of democracy, right? So liberalism places certain limits. Islam, in my estimation, should also have the right and the legitimate right to place certain types of limits on democracy as well. And so that's why an Islamic conception of democracy is something that needs to be more thickly described, more articulated. And just like any other sort of philosophical system, or in this case religion, it can have its own sort of perspective on these sorts of questions. I hope that somewhat answers. I know I digress quite a bit.
No, actually, that's a really important digression, and that's sometimes digressions are the most interesting ways to open up new thoughts. So what I wanted to ask you is, you made an interesting statement, and I think it's a statement that is it's a premise, I think, in a lot of contemporary Islamic thought, and that is that there are notions or terms in Western discourse that have analogs, if you will, in Islamic thought. I'm sorry, as I'm writing, as I'm speaking, I'm like analyzing even the words that I mean, like Islamic thought, like fikr Islami. I mean, what even is that? You know what I'm saying? Because that's a very modern term itself. So
Sure.
So but we are products of our age. We can only speak the language that we have. So, but
But we should be very self-conscious about
yeah,
the sorts of linguistic choices we make, and that's a shift that's taken place, but it can go in other directions as well. So,
but that's what I was going to ask you about, because is it not the case that that often words that we, let's say terminologies that we might think have like Islamic content, and in reality, what we're really doing is anachronistically reading back into classical or pre-modern writing, that we're reading back into that contemporary understandings. And I mean, I'll give an example that, like Anwar al-Awlaqi, in one lecture, I remember he mentioned the ayah, قالت امرأة عمران ربي إني نظرت لك ما في بطني محررا. So he said, is the ayah about the mother of Mary, and she says, "Oh my Lord, I have dedicated to you that which is in my belly, that which is in my womb, or she who is in my womb, muharraran." So from the word hurriya, so the word hurriya is really interesting, and so Awlaqi interprets this in light of contemporary understandings of the word hurriya. But but if you go back and you look and see, what did the Muslims understand the term hurriya to mean, and particularly what did they understand it to mean when the word began to change in Western usage? For example, there's an article I read about the Ottoman ambassador to France during the French Revolution, and he's writing back to the Sultan, and he's saying, yeah, they're talking about hurriya. I mean, I don't even know what they're talking about, because hurriya means, classically and linguistically, it's the state that is opposite of slavery. Enslavement. You're either a slave or you're muharrar. You're in a state of hurriya. So this is, and by the way, I have a personal anecdote on this. Is when I was 19, I'm now 49, but when I was 19, I converted to Islam, and I got this tattoo on my arm which says hurriya. Wait a minute, you can't really say okay, hurriya, freedom. You know what I mean? And my first time in the masjid, I walked in there, and I didn't even tell them that I was interested in converting. I said, "Can someone write for me the word freedom in Arabic?" I wanted to get it tattooed on my arm, and why Arabic? Because it looked cool, and I can actually officially converted like a month later. And my first question about Islam when I walked into the masjid, and by the way, the first person that I met was Omar Lee. So if anyone knows Omar Lee, active on social media and so on, but he was the first person I met in 1992 August when I walked into the masjid in St. Louis to ask about Islam. And my first question, which he loves to tell this story, my first question was, what does Islam say about revolution? And so now and I've got this tattoo of hurriya, so I'm coming into Islam with this, I obviously had been a sort of left-wing activist, and in fact anarchist, at the time when I converted. And so then, like, I am bringing all of these this package of understanding with me, which is it's not as I'm imagining, like somehow I've just come up with this stuff. I'm the inheritor of a couple hundred years of the history of ideas, and likewise when we talk about hurriya, and so you quote in the book Qaradawi, al-Jum'ah, everyone is mentioning the term hurriya, but what does that mean, and what does, for example, this is something I wanted to ask you about as well. So this, الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. الشعب, what is the sha'b? I mean, the sha'b, in Western language, in English, the term the people, that itself has gone through transformations of meaning from the time of the people as understood in like the time of the Magna Carta, for example, culminating in it's like at least contemporarily stable understanding as used by Abraham Lincoln, government of the people, by the people, and for the people in the Gettysburg Address. And so that is a very traceable. I mean, one can do it. I mean, one can do a genealogy, to use the Nietzschean and Foucauldian, term of this of all these ideas, and then to say that there are Islamic analogs. Do we not have to be very, very careful in doing that we're not at the same time interpreting bringing new ideas. Now, I'm not saying that that's because new ideas are by default bad, but what I am saying is that they can throw us off, they can derail us if what we're trying to do. And I think all God-fearing Muslims are trying to do this, is to understand what does our tradition and our religion, our revelation say to us? What guidance does it give to us in our current situation? And if what we're doing is simply reading, post-Enlightenment ideas into our tradition, then haven't we gone off the rails? And to what extent? Here's my question: to what extent? And I'm going to challenge you on this, okay? So is it not possible that both the Islamists and the defenders of the authoritarian nation state are both doing this in different ways from different traditions, and at the same time going back and reading sometimes the same verses, as you point out, sometimes the same verses, like, for example, Allah does not change that which is, the condition of people until they change that which is in themselves, which occurs a couple of places in the Quran.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that both, I think it was Jum'a and Qaradawi, both are citing the same verse.
Qaradawi and Hamza Yusuf, interestingly.
Hamza Yusuf, yeah. Right. Yeah. Yes, thank you. Are both citing the same verse to precisely the opposite effect. And of course, citing the same thing to mean different, to get to the opposite conclusion is not a uniquely modern problem. But anyway, I'm sorry. That was no,
this is really, I mean, it's great to sort of hear your thoughts on this. And I think what I'd start by saying is kind of, I'm tempted to quote a colleague of mine. He's now an assistant, probably an associate professor at Princeton in history. He was a doctoral candidate when I attended his defense, actually. Okay. No, actually, I missed his defense. I can't remember now. So Jack Tanous, he once, as a review of Michael Cook's, I guess still his latest book, Ancient Religions, Modern Politics, he kind of commented by asking, do Muslims, can Muslims think politically? Something along those lines. And, can Muslims engage in sort of thinking of their own? This kind of Hamid Dabashi has an article like, can non-Europeans think? Gayatri Spivak, also at Columbia, has a famous kind of extremely widely cited article called "Can the Subaltern Speak?" I mean, what's really interesting is, in a sense, do you mind if I ask something of a personal question in Aqidah terms? So, what madhab in Aqidah, if any, would you say you subscribe to? So to speak?
Yeah, definitely Athari.
Athari. Okay, so Atharis are a little easier on this front, but if you think about the major sort of schools that emerge in the early period, the Ash'aris and the Mu'tazila come to mind most strikingly, and the Maturidis, of course. I mean, is there anyone who's not affected by their context?
No.
I mean, that's the real question in a sense.
No.
And I think that, that's speaking theologically for a moment, that's the human condition that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us in.
Okay. And, can I stop you really quick, just really quickly? All right.
Sure.
That is true. It is impossible. I mean, you cannot read you can't read the Maturidis or the Ash'ari or for that matter Ibn Taymiyyah or anyone. You cannot read them without understanding Greek philosophical terms. You know what I mean? Because they're
even the Atharis. I mean, like Wilfred Madelung, Sherman Jackson in his book Islam and the Black American, like. He's looking mainly at Ibn Taymiyyah, but Wilfred Madelung is looking, at Ahmad ibn Hanbal's tradition, etc.
Yeah.
That the way in which, just through engaging his interlocutors, Ahmed transformed what Aqidah was. Like the Khalq al-Quran doctrine is an invention of Ahmed in some respects, like that, Quran is غير مخلوق, so to speak. That is a doctrine. And so in many respects, these sorts of ideas are inevitably sort of part of the tug and push and pull of these kinds of dialogues.
I'm going to give you another example, but then then I'll show you how these are actually sort of illustrate how perhaps that doesn't apply to our contemporary problem that we've been discussing. So for example, another thing is that I was asking. I'm in the process of putting together a series of translations of ethical works in Islam on virtue ethics. So, for example, Raghib Isfahani and Imam al-Ghazali and Mawardi and others, some works that they did on ethics. And I was asking a sheikh at Al-Azhar if he would, through WhatsApp, but I was what voice notes on WhatsApp, but I was asking him if he would consider doing a commentary on this series. And he asked me why I had chosen the particular books that I had chosen. And by the way, all these books that I chose are all by very, very well-respected classical scholars, except for the one that he didn't like was Ibn Rushd, the grandson, anyway, so he asked me, why did I choose those? And I said, I'm choosing these because even though there are many ways to discuss akhlaq and virtues of character in the Islamic tradition, one of those ways is in employing the Aristotelian framework of the virtues, like the Ummahat al-Fada'il, the four cardinal virtues, and so on, which is an Aristotelian framework. But at the same time, the Muslims saw it and they said, oh, this, they recognized that this was one of those things that Aristotle, although ostensibly a pagan, had stumbled on the truth. I mean, he was an intelligent man, and he had a lot of insight, and he stumbled on. This is how the Muslims had a lot of respect for him, even though he was. Some people thought he was actually a Muslim in the sense of a muwahid. But anyway, so the sheikh got very upset, and he said, no, he said, we do not. Our tradition did not need, Aristotle to develop this, our thought on ethics, And he says, if you want to know a good book on ethics that you should translate, here's one. And so he sends me through his student. He sends me a PDF of a work. And the funny thing was, this very work itself is using Aristotelian language. You know what I mean? It's so I said,
and that's the point I'm making, in a sense. I mean, if you think
that's the irascible faculty. That's directly translated from Greek.
Right. But this is precisely the point that I'm.
But Sheikh, listen. Here's the thing, though. The thing is that in this thought of, for example, the ancient Greeks, and this is often given as an example. Oh, you're saying that we're not allowed to talk about, or we're not allowed to think in terms of democracy or parliaments and so on. But you are, you neo-traditionalists are relying on, metaphysical language that is used by, that is derived from the Greeks. So you yourselves are, sort of having a, you want to have it both ways. But see, my response to that is that these ancient Greeks, their paradigm of the organization of the order of both the physical and the
ontological
and the transcendent order matched. I mean, it was essentially universally seen that way by human beings. You know what I mean? Yes, the Mushrikeen had had a different cosmology.
I mean, this is really, I always find this intriguing, especially coming from someone who's an Athari ostensibly. I mean, I have teachers from a very broad range of orientations. I have the sorts of teachers whom would respond to that sort of thing, and why are you sort of drawing on the Aristotelians? Muslim didn't need anyone else. But I also have, a scholar like Sheikh Jihad Brown, who had this firm belief that actually the Aristotelian way of seeing things was the correct way.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
it's and
Yeah.
I mean, like, for me, it's like, I just find that very. I find, with all due respect to my many teachers, I'm like, the only thing that's correct in my book is, as Al Junaid says, ittiba' Quran wa Sunnah, and all of these metaphysical frameworks that can be, placed as the groundwork for interpreting those traditions can change, and as a consequence, certain sort of like, I mean, it might be a bit sort of like unfair to describe them as epiphenomenal. I don't think they're epiphenomenal, but the secondary discourses can shift according to what the presuppositions shifting somewhat. I mean, this is very true of all sorts of assumptions that historically we've held Aristotelian, in an Aristotelian sense, in natural philosophy, that have transferred into science, right? Aristotelianism was teleological, and that doesn't work for natural sciences. And
Right.
so in that, those sorts of, if Aristotle was wildly sort of off in terms of realizing utility, I mean, we're not saying that science is a means of accessing truth. We're saying science is a means of accessing utility in the physical world. At least that's how I'm framing it. If he can be wildly off on that, what's to say he won't be wildly off on something else that we've, in many respects superseded? And for me, the only reliable source, or that is unimpeachable, is the Quran and the Sunnah, right? I mean, that's me as a Muslim.
Oh no, of course,
yeah.
that's always the Furqan. But if you look at, for just as an example, right? Look at Plato's dialogue on Gorgias, right? Which is essentially demolishing sophistry, sophism. The idea that truth and reality is relative. Okay,
right.
So he,
but I don't need him to tell me that, because I believe in the absolute truth of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like, I have so many things that preclude the need to resort to that sort of stuff.
No.
It's interesting for me as an antiquarian.
But my point is that his this same argument, obviously the Muslims agreed with. So you can find in Talbis Iblis, for example, a repetition or a restatement of Plato's Plato's demolition of relativism, moral and epistemological relativism. Okay, whereas modernity, and then certainly postmodernity, is an assault on Aristotelianism itself and classical thought itself. You understand what I mean?
But I think you've got things a bit off, if you'll forgive me. So yes, I mean, I think in many respects it's an assault on those sorts of things, for all sorts of reasons that are complicated. But it's not, in my estimation, and this might come across as a bit sort of a contrarian, but I actually believe this. I mean, a lot of people would think I'm wrong on this, but I think modernity is actually remarkably committed to truth. It's just the truth of the nation state. I mean, we've established who the deity is in this system, right?
Yes.
We know that you cross the laws and you'll end up in jail, right? I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which truth and its consequences. I mean, I was just reflecting on the punishment for apostasy in the Islamic tradition, right? This scary punishment that no one wants to talk about. But we know that, during the Obama years, thousands of people were killed in drone strikes. And later on, it's emerged that perhaps 90% of them or more were likely innocent civilians. Now, I mean, in that sort of situation, like, the documentation that we have from Islamic history doesn't suggest in the slightest that anything close to that number of apostates were killed in a systematic fashion, in the way that, the global war on terror creates these norms that are unimpeachable, cannot be questioned, and we uphold them as truth. So that's why I don't think, yes, we live in a postmodern age in some senses, and we relativize certain types of truth, but the state will remain true always, right? And that's where, that's my main problem with people. We've gone a bit off topic, but Bin Bayya and Gum'a are entirely aligned with that logic, and in that sort of sense, they are quintessentially kind of like modern/postmodern, if you want to say.
Well, yeah, I would describe postmodernism as epistemological and moral relativism. I would just say that it equates to that, and that is obviously.
But I mean that doesn't. I mean, again, a lot of people will dislike me for saying this, but that obviously doesn't work in the sense that moral relativism is a pretty morally absolute position to take.
Oh, of
right?
course, that was the argument of Plato. That's exactly the argument of not only Plato but also of Ibn Rajab.
Yeah. And I think it only works in sort of. I mean, I'm not a. I think Foucault has brilliant insights and is wonderful and enjoyable to read, but I don't buy into his nihilism naturally. I mean, like that sort of stuff is, it's. I kind of, again, a lot of people dislike this sort of a comment, and I'm thinking of sort of theoretically oriented academic colleagues, perhaps. But Noam Chomsky, who's like the least theoretically oriented person that one can think of, once he's got this 7-minute clip, I think, on YouTube, which is his kind of panning of French intellectual culture, and he basically says, I mean, the French, they basically need to constantly be popular, and in some respects, they need to be in the headlines and so on, and it's difficult to do original intellectual work, so you make up outrageous stuff, and that's how you sort of like get attention. A very cynical reading of the French intellectual culture, but I'm not sure I disagree with it.
To bring it to why actually I think it's relevant to this discussion, and that is that having annihilated Aristotelian / classical metaphysics, modernity is left with attempting to ground truths in somewhere else other than the divine, and as you mentioned about the nation state, it's really just power. I mean, it's sort of like, the state is the one that determines what is the official religion. It's not, as I mentioned, or the state, as the state is that which determines what is legitimate and what is not, what is law and what is not. Whereas, for example, if you look at Aristotle again, or you look at Aquinas, or you look at Ibn Rushd, who said the same thing, and many of them said a just law, a law that violates God's law is not a law, is not a legitimate law. You know what I mean? So, for example, and this held even in early modern times in the United States, which was an inheritor of this classical worldview, at least at the beginning. So, for example, there were arguments against slavery on the basis of that this is against God's law and therefore it is unjust. So, for example, when the Dred Scott decision came down from the Supreme Court, there was a New York newspaper that said, a Unitarian newspaper that said, whoever obeys this law has disobeyed God. Whoever obeys this decision has disobeyed God. And so that kind of discourse, which was, let's say, like understandable and relatable in late modernity, and especially in America, which is of course anachronistic in maintaining this, this notion of a divine order, and so on. And of course, much less so now. When we look to, sources of legitimacy, and this brings me back to what we were discussing, I think, before we started here, which is what Yusuf al-Qaradawi, you characterize his discussion of the sources of legitimacy. You mentioned his discussion of the will of the people. So I was wondering if you could just recap that, because to me that touches very strongly on the extent to which we are reading modern concepts back into classical period, and maybe I'm wrong about that. So this is something.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, this is basically a development within Islamist thought that has taken place probably most notably from the 1990s onwards. So you have a number of scholars. Qaradawi is hardly the only person who says this. Fahmi Huwaidi, Rashid Ghannouchi, a number of these kinds of people who are designated Islamists. And I'd really love to actually have a discussion with you about what does the word Islamist even mean, right? Because you, in your sort of WhatsApp exchange, we were discussing the term Islamist, and you said like ISIS is also Islamist, and I'm like, wait, we need to talk about this, right? And so, in a sense, what you have with these figures within what I refer to as mainstream Islamist sort of thinking, they're very self-consciously looking at democracy as a kind of a technology of governance, right? And just as other technologies can be adopted and adapted for Muslim purposes, meaning the fact that you and I are, using these certain types of technologies created by largely non-Muslims. I mean, it's kind of, they're not making it as non-Muslims. They're just, that happens to be their identity for the most part. And that's not a problem, obviously. But people obviously feel that when it comes to the realm of ideas, we need to be a bit more discriminating. And in that regard, they point out that we can draw on these sorts of values as, the way I put it, and this is more in my doctoral work in a sense. These are technologies that can be drawn on that are being used in the modern world reasonably successfully relative to what is being used or deployed in our regions. And so democracy is far better than the autocracies of our regions. And we can take an idea like that, especially since it has this kind of global cachet in a sense, and we can try and use it to put pressure on our governments to behave themselves. And really what underlies this, and I kind of try to signal this in the language that I use throughout, is not a deep ideological commitment to democracy itself in the guise that Western societies think is appropriate, through which, for example, in a Western society over the last century, various shifts have happened, which liberalism also underlies this, and liberalism is a progressive ideology. It recognizes that it will have moral blind spots, which it can correct over time, whether it's, giving women greater freedoms, or, giving gay people rights, or, giving the right to abortion, and one thing after the other, sex outside of marriage, etc. These sorts of things that occur in the liberal tradition in Western democracies, things which would have been illegal 100 years ago, are not something which is negotiable for someone like Qaradawi. Or Ghannouchi becomes a bit complicated, and I think Andrew March's book is really good on this. But I in a sense don't consider Ghannouchi to be a mainstream Islamist in that sort of sense. This isn't something that you find in Ahmed Raisuni's writing, although there are interesting and very nuanced discussions about this point, incidentally. This is what I find interesting about this, right? These people are very actively trying to think about, okay, what does a meaningful Islamic politics look like in the modern period? And they're drawing deeply on the sources of the Quran and the Sunnah. They'll cite hadiths like لا يؤم الناس وهم له كارهون, أو لا يؤم الرجل القوم وهم له كارهون, or something like this, أو كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم. That an imam should not lead the people while they dislike him. Mm-hmm. And so, and this is just one instance. I didn't really set out to look at their democratic theory. I try and do that elsewhere. And, Muhammad al-Hassan Walid, one of the, kind of major Islamist thinkers of our time, you could say, but it's a very complicated figure. It's kind of somewhat reductive, like Qaradawi, to just refer to him as an Islamist. He has a 14-minute clip on YouTube where he just in 14 minutes, he gives an extempore justification for democracy, which is extremely persuasive from an Islamic perspective, right? This isn't someone who can be accused of not being well grounded in the Quran, Sunnah, or the traditions of the scholars. So, I think there are sort of these systematic efforts to basically have accountability built in to contemporary governance, because the way in which contemporary governance exists has got nothing to do with Islam in the first place in the Middle East, as we were discussing earlier. And this is a way to maybe bring in a gradual transformation in those sort of spaces. It's not been successful so far, but the status quo is not really something which is good either. I think it can be done in a way that is faithful to the Islamic tradition. These are all ijtihadat. No one here is claiming that they have stumbled upon the truth that everyone must adhere to, and that's just fine.
Yeah. So for example, I mean, there's you've said a lot of interesting things there. So, for example, that and I am not a I'm not a scholar. Obviously, I can only speak about what I have heard from my own teachers and so on. But I mean, or what I've read. So for example, you have Modernity, who discusses whether it's better. I mean, in the same way that, very similar way that Machiavelli does, and others did. I mean, many Islamic scholar ulama did
Mawardi
discuss.
is not a Machiavelli, right?
No, but
شتان ما بينهما.
no, but the question they addressed is the same, which is it better to this particular question, is it better to be for a ruler to be feared or loved? And Isfahani discusses. I mean, many ulama discuss this. In terms of what is better for stability and order. And so they all concluded, at least everyone that I've read, that it is better to be loved. And it is better for the ruler to be loved by the people and to be feared by the people, because this is more conducive. First of all, it's more conducive to order. So it's not necessary to let's say, like, derive some notion of legitimacy lying in the will of the people, or the will of the people, or the will of the majority, or whatever you want to say, to argue that it just simply makes sense for the good of the order and the good of the continuation of, for that matter, I mean, for the continuation of the government itself. So, for example,
but what's the problem with the will of the people as a phrase? Isn't the problem that you have with it the fleshing out of that concept in a very specific sort of Western conception that places sovereignty in the hands of the people, rather than the notion that the people should like their rulers, as you put it?
Okay, so this is a really, really interesting question. It's a very interesting question, and I think that there are different angles to it, or different. There are different angles to it. So one angle is a sort of I don't know if epistemological is the right word, but let's say in the sense of well, in the Anglo-American tradition, as it has achieved its culmination really in the American tradition, building off of the Anglo tradition. As I mentioned, Lincoln's statement of the people, by the people, for the people. This notion is that sovereignty lies with the people. Now, this does not mean, as many Islamist critiques are of this concept, that that means that the people are God, and that they can, because that notion that that government can only be legitimate with the will of the people does not necessarily contradict the notion that law must be in accord with God's law. You see what I'm saying? At least cannot contradict it. In other words, right. The positive law has to be manifestations of this divine law, or at least not contradict the divine law, right? So these are not actually, this is not a contradiction, as many Islams misunderstand it.
I mean, it is in its current iteration, right? I mean, like, divine law has no place in these sorts of modern jurisdictions anymore.
No, that's an excellent, but that's why this is such an interesting question, because there's actually a massive debate about this right now as to whether American jurisprudence has gone way off the rails, because originally Anglo-American law was understood to be grounded in natural law, and that positive law had to. That's why I say that, like, arguments against slavery, legal argument. For example, there's a George Mason, who was the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and one of the authors of the Bill of Rights after the Constitution was approved,
ratified.
Yeah, ratified. Thank you. He as a lawyer, he represented in before the Constitution was ratified. He was representing a group of slaves, and these slaves were arguing that they were free because their mothers were Native American, and he was making the argument. George Mason made the argument that any law that would make these people slaves violates God's law, because the Native Americans did not do anything to deserve slavery from Americans, from Europeans. He said, well, then there were arguments about why there were a lot of like mental gymnastics as to why the African slaves deserved to be enslaved under the law, because, for example, that they had been at war with one another. African tribes were at war with one another, and the slaves that had come to America had simply been been prisoners of war that these warring tribes had simply sold. And so these people had so there was this argument, and bogus as that certainly is. And he actually makes the argument that is a bogus argument, but he says,
but this is still far in the past. I mean, my point is, those sorts of, I live in a country which is technically a theocracy, right? And the Queen is the head of the state and the head of the church,
right?
But that doesn't matter to anything when it comes to the laws. Like, we know that the church has no sort of say in any of this stuff.
Yeah, no, but that's my point. Is that in contemporary times, that understanding is lost. So you can't even really make that argument now without sounding like a nutcase. You call the Christian nationalist if you make that argument.
Yes. If I may, I mean, and this might seem a little provocative, but I do have a lecture that I gave in November. What is a religion? Rethinking Islam and secularism, something along those lines. So, I mean, if anyone's interested, Gresham College, it's available on YouTube. But one of the things that I argue is that, well, actually, if we think about religion as deen through a Quranic conception, looking at someone like Ibn Taymiyyah's conception of religion, for example, and Ibn Taymiyyah has this fascinating conception of religion that basically says a religion is a set of norms agreed on by a community to enable the cohesion of that community and its flourishing, so to speak. Then, as far as I'm concerned, ideas like secularism, liberalism, these are all religions, right? I mean, from within an Islamic conception. So it's not like we don't live in theocracies, right? It's just the theo in that is another set of ideologies, liberté, égalité, and fraternité, for example, right?
Yeah.
And, I don't begrudge these people their right to do that, right?
Yeah.
All I'm saying is that, why are you saying when Muslims do it, that's a problem? When we do it, it's fine.
So this comes back to your question to me, which was, what is my problem with the issue of saying, that the will of the people is determinative of legitimacy or whatever. So in a sense, I'm making the argument that perhaps that makes sense for people who have gone through, let's say, like a process of arriving at that conception from the time of like the Magna Carta down to Lincoln or something like that. You know what I'm saying? That works for them. It makes sense in their context and so on. But does it make sense? And well, first of all, I would say that it's not normative. There are some things that are normative and universal, and there are other things that are not normative and universal, and that a serious mistake happens when there's a category mistake and one so for example, one
none of these scholars say that democracy is a wajib, right?
No one's making that sort of a claim. I'm not talking about democracy. I'm talking about so for example, the neoconservative wars in Iraq and so on, which were, a lot of times people misuse the term neoconservative. I mean, neoconservative is essentially liberalism with the Pentagon behind you, and so they've gone and they go and they invade Iraq, they invade Afghanistan to establish, to do nation building and so on, and this is a massive mistake, because there's, first of all, you're going to go to Afghanistan and you're going to say that you're going to try to establish a representative democracy in Afghanistan, and then you're shocked when it just winds up being warlordism or whatever else, because there's no prerequisite development of thought and institutions that would make that make sense. You go to Saddam Hussein's Iraq and then expect you're going to get, and that's not the only way in which that is a criticism of Muslims. See, that a lot of people say, oh, you're saying that Muslims are not human enough to be done. Well, that itself presumes that democracy, and well, that's a loaded term, but that the premises of of liberalism and a liberal democracy are normative. To say that this is not an appropriate This is not an
I
approach.
understand. Let me kind of respond. I can
It's,
understand the anxiety that. So, I mean, this kind of reminds me of the piece by David Brooke, I think, in the New York Times the day after the Egyptian coup, where he said, "Well, Egyptians aren't ready for democracy," right? I mean, he basically, and the closing line of it is, I mean, Sherman Jackson has a response to it where he basically, says that it kind of reacts in the way that you're suggesting, like, are they subhuman? Like, this can't be countenanced as a reasonable response. But it's very colonial. It's very typical. It's the sort of thing you expect from the New York Times. Let me sort
yeah,
of.
go
I'm
ahead.
not saying that about your perspective
Yeah, yeah,
per
right.
se.
Yeah,
I'm just saying that I think that those of us who've been at the receiving end of colonialism will still respond to this sort of a suggestion by saying, well, it's very rich coming from the colonial or post-colonial, neo-colonial powers when they basically have come and destroyed our sort of infrastructure and institutions for the
I
last two, three
agree.
hundred years,
Totally.
and then they're like, oh well, you shouldn't really do democracy. Well, like who the hell told you it was your choice whether we try or not try? I mean,
But do
it,
you see
it's
that?
it,
But
yeah,
do you
I
see?
understand that's an emotional argument. I'm not sort of
Yeah.
making
All right.
we can discuss the merits of an actual argument as to what the best answer to the current circumstances
Mhm.
are. And as you mentioned in your WhatsApp messages, obviously the region needs some kind of change. But the question is the status quo in the region better than what might come if we sort of try and instigate that sort of change, right?
Mhm.
That was basically your question. And
Yeah.
I mean, that's number one, it's a judgment call. Number two, I'd say that it's not a judgment call for you to make, and I don't think you're making it, but I don't think you should really sort of like I think it's
Oh, I
really up to
disagree. I totally disagree. But go ahead.
okay. I mean, like one of the things that I just said this to a colleague the other day. It's
Yeah.
like when people sort of are like, oh, we have every right to decide who comes into our countries, right? The immigration debate, etc. And there are plenty of Muslims on the right who say things like this, which is very interesting. It's like, yeah, I'd have loved to have that option when the British were dropping into my country like 250 years ago, right?
Mhm.
But just because you happen to have the power to exercise that right doesn't mean it's perfectly okay for you to articulate those sorts of things. I mean, you may have read my piece on Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad's book. So
Mhm.
I have a review of his book where
Yeah.
I problematize precisely that sort of a kind of sentiment, and you know I try and do it as politely as possible, and I hope I'm successful. But it comes across to someone like myself as pretty tone deaf. That
Mhm.
we should. I mean, I'm not saying, and again, this might upset some people. I don't buy into certain liberal ideological sort of like stances, which say, for example, if you're not a woman, you can't talk about women's issues. If you're not a black person, you can't talk about race. I'm
Mhm.
not saying that per se, but I am saying that there is an importance to the sensitivity about these sorts of issues, such that when people who are sort of post-colonials living, come from that region, and they're sort of discussing and debating these sorts of things, their ideas need to be taken as worthy of a certain degree of airtime, shall we say. And when they are told that, look, you have to sit in the waiting room of history until you get to our standards, that's what happens in sort of liberal sort of settings. But I think we need to be wary of when we're doing that, in quasi-liberal fashion. That would be my take on this. But please feel
So
free to sort of
yeah, yeah.
disagree.
Okay, so let's put it this way. If someone comes to me and says, you really need to try this dish that I made. It's cow brains. And I say, no, I'm good. I'm fine. It's not something I really want. And they're like, oh, no, this is the greatest thing ever. And I'm like, well, that's a subjective opinion, and that's just not something I'm particularly interested in. And then my friend over here is like, oh, no, I'm really going to try it. And they try to eat it, and then they like, vomit it or up because it's just not something they're used to, but they're really, really trying, and the guy's like, oh well, neither of you are really just ready for this. The difference between me and the guy next to me is that he is trying really, really, really hard to like it. Why? Because he is presuming, he is accepting as normative a subjective opinion of this guy about his cow brains that he's trying to feed us. Okay, now the same exact thing is what I'm trying to say here about
democracy.
Well, yes, about for example, the notion that the will of the people is determinative of legitimacy. Okay, so this is a Western notion. I mean, it's a Western notion. All right. So,
but again, I mean, it's not that.
Okay. I know that,
but no, that's not the argument that these scholars are making, right?
Okay.
I mean, they're not arguing that.
All right, but let's talk. But for example, Sha'ab Yuri, what is the slogan?
No, but who
presumes that what the Sha'ab Yurid is anyone should care about. You see what I'm saying? That it presumes that.
No, you're missing something very basic here, right?
I just want to, before we get to what I'm missing, and I want to hear what I'm missing. Before we get to that, I just want to articulate that to take offense at the notion that the Middle East or the Islamic civilization, regardless of the extent, the state of it right now, but to argue that Islamic civilization is not the best fit for what Anglo-American political theory has arrived at in 2022. Okay, is to take offense.
But who on earth says that? I mean, this is the thing. You're creating these straw men and arguing against them.
No,
who on earth says this?
No, I'm not because what I'm trying to say is that the idea that that this political theory in the West, which has a genealogy, and which has a history.
I mean, you just talked about the genealogy of Aristotelianism within the Islamic thought process, right? I mean, this goes back to
but it has its merits. It has its merits. You see?
Oh, okay, but this one doesn't. I mean, this is the point, right? I mean, these are precisely the ijtihadi.
We're discussing are they meritorious? You see, and so to question whether or not they're meritorious is.
I'm not saying that.
Wait a minute, just a minute. To say that it's not appropriate for a non-Egyptian or a non-whatever to question whether or not these ideas have or possibly to question whether or not they have some sort of they clash in some way with fundamental principles of our deen is not to say that Muslims are not worthy, they're not good enough. You see what I'm saying? To argue that, to believe, to understand that to mean that Muslims are not worthy or not good enough is to assume the normative universality of principles that are in fact historically contingent.
No, but this is where, I mean, it's really a little frustrating talking about this because I'm trying to point out that that's precisely not what we're doing, right? I mean, that's
unless you talk,
I mean, it's really, I mean, I'll try, but this is a point that I've made already, and I made it in my WhatsApp message as well.
Sure.
And to a certain extent, in my estimation, Brother Ismail, I mean, I think what's happening, this is a point I made earlier in a separate message.
Right.
You have a deep sense in which you feel this to be the case, what you've just articulated, such that no matter what is said to you, you're going to constantly sort of push back against it and say, no, but still this.
Well, I don't want to do that. So,
sorry?
I don't want to do that.
I understand you're going to try not to do that, and I hope we can have a productive conversation where you can see that actually no, that's not what we're right now. I feel like I'm disagreeing with you on something which I don't believe about. I don't hold to that position. But you're putting me in that position, and then you're saying no, and that's why you're wrong. That's what you're telling me, right? It's extremely frustrating to have that sort of conversation. Obviously,
I'm sorry. I don't actually I don't mean to make this conversation about you. I'm really talking about the position that.
But even the position of the scholars that I'm talking about, as I've articulated already, I mean, they don't have any particular sort of they're saying in the same way. Look, I happen to use a Samsung phone, another person uses an iPhone. I'm not going to have an argument about why are you not using an Android device, why are you using an iOS. These people are non-committal. They're basically saying, look, we need accountability in our government systems.
Right.
Okay, that's why I use the term accountability constantly. Sometimes I use it as a substitute for sort of democracy. And accountability is something which is, I think, deeply embedded within the Islamic tradition, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not something which is controversial.
Yeah.
And the fact that something is coming up in, okay, it's got a genealogy which goes back to sort of, in this particular case, who does, I don't know that many supporters for democracy, but it goes back to the ancient Greeks, right? I mean, Aristotle and Plato both were against it. Yeah. But in any case, I mean, it goes back to that sort of a genealogy. It has a sort of modern Western genealogy, representative of democracy arises in a particular context, etc.
Right.
That democratic theory is highly fraught as a discourse within Western political philosophy. It's hardly straightforward, right?
Right.
And there are various different iterations of it: deliberative democracy to direct democracy, and so on. And direct democracy can have very challenging consequences, as we are experiencing in the UK with Brexit. And so, all of that complexity is reduced to, oh, this is Western, and therefore we must have an analogy. And these people over here that I'm trying to write about, right, they're not even interested in the Western conception of it. They're looking for a discursive tool. Democracy globally has great discursive power that allows them to puts them in a stronger position vis-a-vis authoritarians, right? It's a strategy in part. It's also true that some of them, because they've spent so much time since the 80s, in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, so much time talking up democracy, that they have developed a genuine commitment to the idea of electoral, legitimacy, right? There's nothing wrong with electoral legitimacy. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the four madhabs, right? That's istilah that the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah came to agree on, right? I don't have a problem with that. But yes, if someone basically says, look, this developed later on and I don't like its genealogy as being sort of like post-prophetic, etc., fine. I don't have a problem with you, and that's perfectly reasonable. You can do that. But what I'm saying is that, there's no question in your mind as well that the status quo in the Middle East region, I mean, like, the reason this may come across as quite offensive for people who live in the Middle East, and I consider myself like an appendage to the Middle East because I spent many of my years living there, and my wife is from that region, and I speak Arabic better than I speak Bengali, and all of these sorts of things. But and I apologize to any listeners who are from the region who may feel offended just by the tone of this discussion, because basically what we're doing is we're saying, should these people have the right not to be tyrannized or not, right? And I understand you're not saying that, but that's the tonality point that I'm trying to make as well, right? And that's what's so crucially important. Should these people have the right not to live under tyrannical regimes?
Yeah.
And that's the question. They're not saying,
but that's a different yes, no,
that is the question. This is the point that I'm trying to make. It's not then Qaradawi isn't saying, should we have democracy or not? He's actually saying, what's the best strategy to get out of a tyrannical regime? And his discourse, his refrain is constantly about tyranny, right?
Right.
So to really struggle to misread him is an unfair reading of him, in my estimation.
Well, I mean,
he says explicitly in other writings, and this is something which is a standard refrain across the Islamist sort of the mainstream Islam. I mean, people like Ghanouchi and Jasr Auda, and these people are kind of outliers. They say, نحن ندعو إلى دولة لا ندعو إلى دولة دينية، نحن ندعو إلى دولة مدنية مرجعيتها الإسلام. Okay, and that the sort of the people have what's the phrase that they use? ما لم يخالف القرآن والسنة, or ما لم يخالف الشرع. The people can choose their sort of like rulers and choose their laws and those sorts of things, as long as it's not contradicting the Quran and the Sunnah. In the same way that a constitutional document places limits, right? The people can do whatever they like as long as they don't run up against the US Constitution, for example, in the United States.
Right.
Or the state constitutions in the various local state environments as well.
Yeah, or natural law in an earlier understanding.
In an earlier iteration as well, yeah.
Right. Well, okay, so...
But please feel free to push back against me. I understand, I'm talking about sort of like...
Well, I think one of the...
offense and so on, but...
as I mentioned, earlier before we spoke, I think one of the benefits of this is to be able to try to narrow the realm of disagreement to see what it is that we're actually disagreeing on, because the result of that is to see that we may agree on a lot more than we disagree.
And I hope also later on perhaps we can have a bit of a discussion about Hamza Yusuf as well.
Yeah. I had really wanted to get to that, and we're running up against the end of our time here. But my colleague Nathan has said that we can have a few more minutes, because I could actually talk with you for another hour, I think. But I
could as well.
Yeah. So to roll it back and to clarify, if the question is simply, because let's talk about what we do agree on. Okay. I mean, it's almost like objectively the case, that the regimes in the Middle East, to greater or lesser degrees, because they're not all equally bad, but they're more or less bad. They're more or less kleptocracies. They're more or less regimes that are interested in their own existence and their own continuation, far more than they are interested in the common good, far more than they are interested in pleasing God. And so the consequence of such regimes, I mean, some of them are less capable of doing damage than others. Some of them are less interested in harming people than others, but none of them are seem particularly interested in achieving the aims of what governance is supposed to be for, And so this is a problem.
I think, I mean, but the aims of what governance is supposed to be for is also, of course, a matter of considerable discussion and debate.
No doubt, but
by unanimous consent, unanimous agreement, they get it wrong.
It's preservation. Yeah, it's supposed to be preservation of religion, preservation of life, property, and so on. Right. So these regimes are by and large interested in the preservation of themselves at the expense of those things, and that is pretty clear, at the expense of justice. So the question is really, what do we do? What can be done, in order to address this situation in a way that doesn't make it worse, and in a way that doesn't be anger, which is related, which doesn't anger our Creator, and which doesn't violate the norms and that we're as Muslims are supposed to be following. And so that's really what it boils down to. And so, by the way, this is why I completely reject the notion that I as a American or American convert or whatever, or a white person, or whatever, am not allowed to have any opinion, because actually, what we're talking about is Islamic civilization, and I'm not. I mean, the entity of being American, or the notion of being American, has its meanings, but it does not negate that I am part of the Ummah. It does not negate that I have an interest in the revival and preservation of Islamic civilization, and the Ummah itself.
I sympathize with that perspective, certainly, as I kind of alluded to earlier, but I would just say that there is something which, so, in a sense, you can talk about, from a fiqh perspective, you can talk about sort of the bare minimum, what is yajuz, and you can also talk about istihbab, in a sense, what would be recommended. And I think the tonality side of things, especially, and this is something which I tried to convey in my sort of response. Hopefully you can have a look at my response to Shah Abdul Hakim Murad's, Tim Winter's book, Traveling Home. That, in a sense, if I am coming from a place where my interlocutors may actually, however wrongly this may be construed, conceive of me as somehow, participating in a discourse of dispossession that has been intimately associated, for example, with the United States, or, in my case, with Britain, or something like that. I should be alive to that, and I shouldn't simply disregard that because I have this, deep commitment to my right to be able to say whatever I like, part of which is a consequence of the fact that, we may be conferred certain advantages over members of the global south for all sorts of reasons by being in these parts of the world. I understand you, in your personal experience, in your personal journey, have struggled a lot as well, and faced a lot of disadvantage because of your religious commitments as well. So, in a sense, you didn't enjoy the quote unquote white privilege.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Didn't help me out much.
Sorry?
I said it didn't help me out much.
It didn't help you out much. And so, yeah, I mean, but I just think that it's still worth not being entirely dismissive of that, while at the same time not shying away from the fact that, look, you have, views that you can engage interlocutors with, recognizing our different positionalities, shall we say.
Well, and okay, so let's. I actually don't think that. I think it's way less interesting for our conversation to be about like me and you. It's way more interesting to be about about the ideas, and
Yeah,
so
that's fine.
yeah, and so I think that as I said, we can agree on the problematic nature of these regimes. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I
but
mean,
what do you do about it? That's your question.
what do you do about it is a question. And for me, like I was not aware before I read your book. I was not aware of Yusuf al-Qaradawi's very
pragmatic.
I think correct, and certainly reflective of, I mean, it's not upon me to, to say that an alim is correct or not correct, but I mean, anyway, it accords with what what I've learned from my teachers, that, that a rebellion against, of course, there are many conditions under which rebellion can take place, and one of those is that where you have like a disbelieving but
even that is conditional, right?
And even
that's conditional on qudra.
Well, right? I was just gonna say that like you could have the you could have the worst Satan worshiping tyrant, and if lifting a finger against them is going to cause like the destruction of the whole city or something, then you're actually not permitted to do anything about it in that situation. So I liked it was beneficial for me to read that Qaradawi actually agreed with that analysis, because actually I don't really find anything to disagree with him on any of that, other than, and again, with that qualification that it's not my place to disagree. All I mean to say is that what happens is that when you get into, well, what we need to do is we need to rebel peacefully. And you make the point.
That's a contradiction in terms, right? I mean, what does rebel mean in the English language, right?
Well, yeah. But also, not only that,
to engage in armed insurrection.
Okay, now you make the point as well that many, let's say, like many people who were against the protests and against the Arab revolutions were conflating violent insurrection or khuruj with, with
protests, peaceful protests.
Peaceful protests. And Sheikh al-Qaradawi repeatedly admonished and encouraged people to be peaceful, but there seems to be a sort of a break with, with all due respect to him, a break with, or a lack of understanding of the reality that the Egyptian government, or especially like the Syrian government, is not simply going to allow, hundreds of thousands of people to be marching through the streets and just allow that to be peaceful. They're going to do what? They're going to come in there, they're going to fire on people, or they're going to send in agent provocateurs to create a pretext where they can massacre people. You know what I mean?
But does that? I mean, so this is we're getting some very interesting terrain here, because basically, what is the most appropriate pragmatic thing to do here, right? That's the question.
Exactly. That's what it is. That's the question.
Yeah. And I would submit that at the end of the day, like, people will have legitimate disagreements on this, because different things will work under different circumstances, and so much of this is happenstance, and so much of this is accidental circumstances, and so on. And so as a consequence, like,
and the question of, for example, what you mentioned about Syria, and I think that you said that even Sheikh Abdullah bin or Ramadan al-Bouti, or someone, not Bouti, but someone,
not Bouti, but Abdullah bin Bayyan.
Yeah, right. But that when when there's an insurrection going on, or when there's a war going on, that's a different situation than should you have done the protest in the first place, even if the war has occurred as a consequence of protests that perhaps were not well advised in the first place, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated. I mean, in the case of Bin Bay, he doesn't say like protests were okay in the first place. He basically
Right.
just says, look, yes, if they hadn't taken up arms, it would have been ibadah jama'iyya. That's the
Yeah.
phrase he uses. So
Right. Right.
people are compelled, otherwise they would have been annihilated. So
Exactly.
there, it's a
Yeah.
self-defense argument. And
Right.
Qaradawi's arguments in Libya and Syria were both basically self-defense arguments, right? That's actually a wajib shar'an.
Exactly.
I mean, people.
It's like Bosnia, and the Serbs are massacring, and you don't do anything. You're actually sinning by not doing anything.
Right. But that's a different scenario to what you're talking about, which is that if you have a situation where, well, I mean, Egypt is a very striking example, right? Because there was ibadah jama'iyya of a small section of the population. There was successful sort of polarization within society, and the Muslim Brotherhood was successfully marginalized. They killed, I suggest 1,000 to 2,000 people on the day of the Rabaa massacre, but of course, plenty of people before and after. They imprisoned 50 to 60,000 people in the prisons. They actually built and extended. But if you're considering a country of 100 million people, that is relatively small, right? So how much, can be managed? And that's why Qaradawi doesn't say, look, you need to take up arms against Sisi, because it's not a civil war situation. It's not, perhaps he would, if pressed, say that if you were able to get your hands on a gun in Rabaa, yes, you can defend yourselves because you're literally being shot at.
Right.
But to expand beyond that, no, he was very determined to say, no, it has to continue to be peaceful. In some respects, people might turn around, and I'm not suggesting that this is my opinion in the slightest, but people might turn around and say, well, the failure of the Muslim Brotherhood is they didn't turn violent, right? But state building is always a horribly messy affair, and I think there are good reasons, and I kind of signal this in chapter 9, why Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah shifted away from the tendency to say that every wrong needs to be corrected by force, right? Yet, and this is something I point out in the beginning of chapter 9, quoting Khalid Abul Fadl, what is the position of Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah on a rebellion? Do you want to sort of do you remember this?
No,
sorry, this it's quite late in the book, and I apologize for the length of this book, but
go ahead.
So Khalid Abul Fadl basically says, this is, I think, page 19 of his book on rebellion, published in the year 2001. Fantastic and quite a demanding read, actually. It's very, very dense. He says that, look, what does quietism even mean? People talk about quietism as a doctrine, as Sunni doctrine. If it's a case that you don't fight against a rebel, okay, who comes and usurps the position of the imam, and then you acquiesce to them, you've legitimated their rebellion, right? So and if you fight against the rebel, then obviously you're not a quietist either. I mean, in a sense, the quietism doctrine, the challenge to that doctrine, and this is something which is very often attributed to Al-Mawardi, who basically affirmed the Sultan. The Sultan emerges by that point. I mean, the Caliphate really weakens in the 9th century, and the Sultan emerges and basically comes. Mawardi's writing in 450, which is 1058, so 11th century. The Caliph is no longer really the meaningful power. The Sultan, which is basically a Turkish warlord, as far as I recall, comes, and he is the de facto ruler. And the Caliph, Mawardi says it's legitimate for the Caliph to basically exercise a legal fiction and say that I grant you as the Sultan, right? I affirm you as the Sultan. Thereby, the Caliph kind of maintains his technical authority, kind of like the Queen in the UK affirming the Prime Minister, right? I mean, she doesn't have a choice in the matter. But constitutionally, it's extremely important that she's recognized as the head of state. And so, by affirming that, I can't remember why I went off on this tangent. I mean, the Caliph, isn't really
rebellion and the legitimation.
I mean, people say that, Mawardi's being a quietist, he's not rebelling against the Sultan. And the point that I make drawing on Noah Feldman is actually, he's engaged in a masterstroke. He's legitimated the Caliph against all odds, right?
Mhm.
And the public domain is in the hands of the ulama, the jurists, and all of those sorts of things. And so you have a situation whereby things stay the same. The ulama still are in normative control.
Right.
Sovereignty still belongs to the Sharia. I don't know if I use that phrase exactly. Whereas what we're having now, the significant difference between that and what Gum'a and bin Bayya are doing is Gum'a and bin Bayya are going to the state and saying, I am at your service. Whatever you like, that's what I will do. Okay, I mean, I understand you might not like that designation of
Yeah.
Abdullah bin Bayya.
Well,
But,
regardless of whether that's accurate about Ben Bayya, I
sure.
see your point about Ali Juma, and of course, in fact, a lot of disturbing things that you quote him as having said, so definitely there's like so many different angles here that need to be discussed. But what I did want to mention is take that example of what you just said about the point you made about legitimating the state. And let's go back to the point I was trying to make. And I actually think I've been misunderstood. You misunderstood me.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay. No, that's okay. I mean to say that I think that there's a difference between. I don't think that, or at least it's worth asking whether democracy, whatever you want to call it, popular, popular uprising, whatever you want to call it, as a means of achieving accountability. There's a question of whether this is a technology, as you mentioned. So technology has an implication of neutrality. Okay, so there's a question of whether this is actually a neutral thing. So I was hopefully not mischaracterizing what Sheikh al-Qaradawi or anyone says, but there is nevertheless this notion that, and I cited the slogan of the revolution, the most well-known slogan. I'm not saying it's the only slogan, one of the most well-known slogans, which contains that assumption that the people's will is something that is like determinative of what. And what I mean to say is that, not regardless of whether Sheikh al-Qaradawi was saying that, you're unleashing with a with like sort of massive protest. You're unleashing of chaotic forces that do not, especially in our time and era of where people are ignorant of the religion, or they may be influenced and pulled different directions by different ideologies and so on. They're not all on the same page when it comes to who is that God is divine over the state, and over the individual, for that matter. You know what I'm saying? So in other words, one appears to be locating legitimacy.
What do you think about the UAE doing exactly the same thing, unleashing those forces?
It's terrible. It's terrible. You know what I mean? Well, look.
In Egypt and Tunisia, for example, yeah.
No, I mean that's exactly I think that's the problem. I mean, the problem is that when you have you don't have everyone on the same page in terms of what are the principles of this movement to.
And what do you think of the fact that before this, so what you're saying is the unpredictability is worse than the tyranny that preceded it?
Not exactly. Okay, so I do think that unpredictability is a major issue, and I think that even Sheikh al-Qaradawi, at least from what I read, acknowledges that there's an element of that has to be factored in. Okay, so it's not just the unpredictability of revolutions, and that's, I mean, it's demonstrably true that revolutions are unpredictable. Okay, it's not just that, right? It's that they are being unleashed what is by its nature unpredictable, on top of the fact that there is no longer a consensus among the Muslims on really important principles, such as, for example, that God is divine over not only the state but also the individual. You see, so
what's interesting for me, if you don't mind me saying so, is that like before that revolutionary moment,
right,
the de facto reality is that the
state is divine.
Not just the state, the actual head of state, the dictator is the divine sort of like.
Agreed.
And they use the language of, God has chosen this person. They are Sheikh Hamza uses this language, the shadow of God on earth. And you know,
No.
and I ironically state,
I
you know,
keep saying let's narrow our realm of disagreement, and I agree with you. The nation in the modern nation state, and particularly in these regimes, the
right.
state is divine. The state is in effect the divinity. Okay.
So then you should support the Islamists in particular, because they, by displacing that sort of divinized dictator,
Mhm.
are now introducing the possibility that Islam can start to substitute in that space, which has been so dominated and really hegemonized by figures like Nasser, figures like Bourguiba, figures like,
You know, and
in
this is
various states. Yeah.
yeah, and this is where I bring in what I mentioned, which is that although that is a very bad situation where Sisi or Mubarak or the ruler of the UAE or whoever is seen as is essentially de facto divinity, then is it going to really be any better if we only even if I were to agree that the Islamists were a good alternative to that, right? And I don't agree, by the way. It's not guaranteed that the Islamists are going to get into power, because you've got other factors in society. You've got other poles in society.
And you think that those other poles, if they elect a representative government, which, in a sense, is closer to a Western model, that's worse than having a dictator? That's your opinion?
I don't know, because look at, for example, look at Sudan. Look at these different places where there have
They
been.
haven't. I mean, they haven't been successful precisely because countries like Abdullah bin Bay's sponsor, the UAE, have been so instrumental in preventing democracy. Right?
Yes, but don't we have the foresight to see that that's what's going to happen? In other words, like we said, oh well.
So what you're saying is we should hold our breath and do nothing, so long as it's not possible for us to guarantee that the UAE and all of these other forces will not have any impact whatsoever. So just grin and bear it. You've got these dictatorships. That's the best that you can hope for.
What I mean, well,
it doesn't sound very appealing, but I mean, I can understand that position is a coherent position.
If the alternative is foreseeably worse, okay,
but it's not foreseeably worse, right? I mean, it's never foreseeable.
But it is foreseeable that it's foreseeable that that these regional forces are not going to allow some sort of I don't know, representative democracy.
Look, I mean, as someone who studies the region and was obviously closely observing the way in which right. I had the good fortune of being around a lot of very talented scholars, as I mentioned, Nathan Brown sitting in the room when the Egyptian coup literally took place. I can tell you for certain nobody was able to predict 2011, right? I mean, this is well known, and nobody really thought. I mean, a lot of observers were saying, look, 2012 to 2013 could have been transformative rather than the coup happening.
It could have. Could have. Yeah,
and these are very well informed, close observers of the region.
But no one saw the Muslim Brotherhood being expelled from their position. No one saw that. No one saw this coming. No one predicted that it could, that there was a pretty good chance that they just didn't.
So, I mean, as I say, as someone who was sort of like reading very closely and also in discussions with some of the closest, most careful observers, people who were in the midst of it very often. Mm-hmm. These were respected scholars. I'm thinking Nathan Brown, Mohammed Fadil. Right. I was attending Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer's longest serving US ambassador to Egypt. He's at Princeton. I don't know if he still is, but he was when I was there. Yeah. His in the week or so before Mubarak went, like hundreds of people were attending his lecture on these sorts of themes, having discussions with scholars who were, and a lot of them were like basically saying, look, it's not clear where this is going to go. And this is the point that, Abdullah bin Bayy is saying as well, majhul, right? And what you're saying is, look, couldn't you have predicted that things would have become a lot worse? Hindsight is 2020, right? Yes, I mean, this is what Ibn Khaldun says, and I quote this possibly in a footnote. So, that Ibn Khaldun says that the problem with the rebellion doctrine is that the ulama always took it as a license to engage in rebellion, right? The Islamic rebellion doctrine because and his critique, and I quote Michael Cook on this, is that It's not that they were committing a sin in engaging in that sort of rebellion, but they were doing it imprudently. They were doing it when they didn't have the resources to succeed. And so, my answer to you in this particular
Mhm.
instance is, look, I can understand that it looks really bad after the fact. And, I have, you know, I, I have friends and indeed relatives in other parts of the world who've died in prison because they have Islamist connections or something along those lines, right? And I don't take this stuff lightly, right? But at the same time, I live with kana sallallahu alaihi wasallam yu'jibuhu al-fa'lu al-hasan, right? And that can be interpreted in various ways. That the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to like having a positive, optimistic look upon life, you could say. I mean, being positive in his orientation. And for me, it's like, wait, if there is an opportunity, then this is something which we should reflect on whether it should be taken. And if, we don't really know which way it's going to go, but there is hope, let's look for the hope. At the end of the day, the terrible consequences that have resulted were not really possible without the forces of the UAE and so on, which
Right, right.
who backed the scholars, unfortunately, as well.
Well, not only
Um,
UAE, but also
Saudi
Iran,
Arabia,
Saudi Arabia, Iran,
right,
ISIS.
right.
The sum, like the summary or the conclusion of the Arab Spring and the Arab revolutions, unfortunately, and this is not, this is
Have you
not.
read David Kirkpatrick's book on this, incidentally?
No, but I just
Definitely read his book because it will give you a different perspective, because
well,
it just shows you the amount of contingency built into these things. He was having conversations with sort of the US ambassador. A lot of stuff in Washington was the deciding factor on whether Rabaa happens or not.
well, this is one of the yeah, but this is okay. Point taken, and I'll look at that. But if you look at, for example, Iraq, and one of the major arguments against invading Iraq is, you're pulling a lid off a situation, and you're the de-Baathification. Now you've like loosed a
But
lot of.
Iraq is a very different story to. I mean, so
Iraq
again,
is very different, but Iraq is very different. But then you have
قياس مع الفارق, as they say in usul fiqh.
their invasion into their incursions into Syria and taking over. You know what I'm saying? I mean, like these are all related things that are happening.
Yeah, I know, but that's why you need informed judgment about these things, right? I mean, you're sort of like lumping together a lot of very disparate phenomena, and what I would encourage people to do is to sort of
No, because
either develop expertise in the area or consult those who have expertise in the area and
no,
see what they think.
No, because I'm discussing how beyond Egypt and beyond Iraq, I'm talking about, for example, in Syria, where the one can have been at that time saying, all right, well, we have to join this fight, or else we're all going to be massacred. You know what I'm saying? But if it had people, realize that Assad is a psychopathic, maniac,
Right.
and not only that, but there are other psychopaths, in the name of Islam, who will, you know what I'm saying, who are willing to massacre people in the name of their vision. So what I mean to say is that it seems to me, and we're wrapping up now. It seems to me that what it boils down to is, for many people, and I'm not talking about someone like Ali Jum'a who makes frankly very evil statements, and I'm talking about reasonable people can disagree and say that the question is, what is to be done about this terrible state of stagnation, political stagnation in the Muslim world and the Middle East, and that some people will come down on the side of, okay, we need to have a hopeful, optimistic point of view, and launch some sort of, and even uniting with people who are totally diametrically opposed to our Islamic viewpoint, with the hopes that there's going to be something better that will come about as a result of hopefully displacing these regimes. And on the other hand, those who say, I see your point. However, I fear that the potential, and perhaps I'm being pessimistic, or perhaps I'm being I'm misunderstanding the amount of power we have or whatever to affect change. But I fear that the results are going to be worse, and that for now we have to bide our time and do all that we can do, which right now is to make sure I'm praying Fajr on time, make sure my family is believing, and so on and so on, until such time that Allah makes a way out for us, which is not simply.
That's an absolutely reasonable sort of point of disagreement. I mean, reasonable people can disagree. What I'd say is that, and to bring it back to sort of like Hamza Yusuf and Abdullah bin Bayya, their sort of like position, of course, is the position of unreasonable people, right? They're not saying that, look, we're going to bide our time. They're actively going and supporting the UAE, which is the most ambitious state in the region. I know from sort of my impression is, at least, Sheikh Hamza is doing this because Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya is doing it, and he's his teacher, and I can see a logic to that, even though I disagree with it. Abdullah bin Bayya is a thoroughly informed sort of like scholar and politician with a long, illustrious career. He knows. I mean, I struggle to think that he doesn't know what he's doing. He's tied his fortunes to the UAE, and I'm sure it's doing him a lot of favors in many respects. But that's something which reasonable people cannot agree is a reasonable approach, in my view.
Well, there's so much here that we left discussed. For example, that subject, the subject of what do you do, when your favorite alim is doing something that you disagree with, on other, ethically and so on. I hope that we've managed to come back around and to some extent narrow the range of disagreement. While
we have to have another session at some point. Perhaps you can drop into my sort of like YouTube channel at some point.
I would love to. That'd be awesome. All right. And so we're going to wrap it up here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Al-Azami. Hang out for a little bit, and when we
no worries.
Here. And thank you, everyone, for listening. We hope this was an interesting discussion for everyone. And,
thank you, RFI, for hosting us. I mean, it's really been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Assalamu alaikum.